Joining us on this edition of the News Review, we have author and commentator John Stepling, who's joining us from Inderøy, Norway. And we also have journalist and political commentator Fred Weir, who's with us from the Russian capital, Moscow. Gentlemen, welcome to the program. Let's start off with Mr. Stepling. I want to get your perspective on the United States announcing yet again a new batch of military aid to Ukraine. Russia has repeatedly warned about the consequences of more weapons supplied to Kiev. Is there a threat that this can spill over into other regions and possibly making this conflict morph into something bigger?
Well, of course, there's a danger of it. Look, the U.S. has fought against any peace initiative, any kind of brokering of compromise between Ukraine and Russia. They don't want peace. They want a protracted war. They'd like a protracted but somehow controlled conflict. The money that is being poured in terms of weaponry, cash, training, this has been going on a long time. The U.S. started training the Ukrainian military even before 2014. This is set against the backdrop of social crisis in the United States, across the EU. The introduction, the commentator talked about the rise in prices in the EU. Even in relatively affluent Norway, gas prices, food prices have skyrocketed. I mean, unprecedented costs that are finally, even here, people are struggling to make ends meet. It's much worse in other places, obviously. In the United States, this is a country suffering unbelievable unemployment, homelessness, a general despair across every part of the country. But the U.S. government doesn't care about that. These are ideologues who are in power, the Straussian neocons. They have a plan. They have targeted Russia since the fall of the Soviet Union. None of this is new. And I've never seen the unleashing of propaganda of this magnitude ever in my life. The Russophobic propaganda, the anti-Russian stuff is almost comical if it weren't so sort of tragic, really. But Russian chess players can't play in world tournaments. Ice skaters can't compete. I mean, ridiculous things. And when you look at it, this entire conflict has been fomented by the United States, unnecessarily expanding NATO to the previously, described by mainstream press. Ukraine had been for the previous years described as most corrupt country in Europe, but suddenly it's the darling of the West. They put in a government in 2014 that was handpicked by Victoria Nuland, John McCain. And Russia has essentially been left with very little choice. And, the people in Donbass, of course, think Putin stopped a war. He didn't start one. That was a region being shelled for 6 or 7 years. Russia went to the UN in 2018 asking for peacekeepers. They have bent over backwards trying to solve this without compromising their security. But as I said at the beginning, the U.S. wants a conflict, and that hasn't changed, and they just keep escalating and doubling down on the mistakes they're making.
Fred Weir in Moscow, I want to get your thoughts on what Mr. Stepling just said, that the United States, in fact, wants a conflict. The U.S. President Joe Biden has said Washington will continue to support Ukraine for as long as it takes. Is that what they're aiming for here, to make this a prolonged and protracted conflict in hopes of weakening Russia?
I do agree that the United States has embraced this conflict. I think there's a lot of blame to go around, and I don't absolve Putin of his share. I think it was a reckless move to invade Ukraine, but yes, there's a long story leading up to that decision. And after Russia did invade Ukraine, the United States and its allies clearly went all in to try to to weaken Russia. I think they said as much, to try to restore or even enhance some kind of American leadership or hegemony, whatever you want to call it, by using this crisis to pressure other countries like India into joining the American effort against Russia, to demonize Russia, yes. And so that's all true. And I think that the constant flow of arms and aid into Ukraine is prolonging the war, deepening it. And since it's occurring completely in the absence of any diplomatic efforts on the part of the United States or any other leading Western power, you may assume that that's what they want.
And staying with you, Mr. Weir, Russia says that the U.S., of course, has warned Washington's weapons supply to Kiev increases the risk of a direct confrontation. Those are comments echoed by Russian officials earlier, that basically those countries, NATO countries, that are supplying Ukraine with weapons and that are training its forces are basically in a direct conflict with Russia at the moment.
I think it's established in this conflict that Western arms into Ukraine are not going to provoke Russia into a wider war. I think what the Russians mean, of course, it just makes them furious that this is happening. And if you can't understand that, think about how the Americans reacted at the mere suggestion that Russians might be meddling in Afghanistan, maybe giving bounties to Taliban troops to kill Americans. They freaked out over it. Big countries will. But I think that what they are really worried about, and anyone, any analyst should be, is that there are a lot of gray areas. Arms advisors are coming over the border. They're setting up there. The Russians are hitting those things. I'm pretty sure they are killing foreign advisors. But there can be an incident in this chaos, especially around the western borders of Ukraine, where NATO and its agencies are overlapping with Ukraine. I think that the danger of misunderstanding, miscalculation is very high.
And Mr. Stepling, your final thoughts on the issue as well. Also, if you may, while we're on the topic, why does NATO continue to exist today? What's the purpose of NATO?
Yeah, good question. No, NATO has no real reason to exist. The United States has manufactured a narrative that they are selling to the leaders of the EU that they need protection from an expansionist Russia. This is nonsense. Russia has no intention of invading anybody in the EU. It's ridiculous. And Putin can be accused of many things, but in this particular context, I don't see that Russia was left with a great deal of choice, frankly. 14,000 civilians, Russians really, were killed in Donbass over 7 years of shelling from the Kiev regime. This seems to pass without comment in an awful lot of discussions about this conflict. But Fred is right when he talks about there already being advisors killed. This is almost a certainty from what I know. And if you go back to Vietnam, this is how Vietnam started. Advisors were going in, military and civilian. Ukraine is flooded with them. They're flooded with Western mercenaries. And countries like Poland are itching to join this fight. Their blind hatred of Russia is a very dangerous, presents a very dangerous situation, actually. So the possibility of direct conflict, well, I mean, look, the U.S. is already party to this war. They're already involved in it in a direct way. Russia has been very circumspect, and they don't want, as Fred said, an incident. I think it's Russia that's trying to avoid an incident, and they've been very restrained in how they've conducted this military campaign. But you know, the danger is just how far the zealots in Washington are willing to push things. Meanwhile, you know, you have this crisis in the EU. Winter is coming. People are going to get angrier and angrier. There are protests across the EU that are never reported on in Western mainstream media. We're seeing the destruction of the agricultural sector in the Netherlands, farmer protests in Germany, Netherlands, France, Italy. People are becoming more and more desperate in a sense. They fear for the future. The U.S., as I said, the despair and hopelessness is palpable when you cross the country, and the unemployment situation is just unbelievable. So, and nothing is being done. Nothing's being done about the homeless situation. Nothing at all domestically is being addressed. Meanwhile, billions and billions are being funneled in to this ideological project of the Straussian neocons in D.C.
All right, thanks a lot, gentlemen. John Stepling, author and commentator, joining us from Inderøy, Norway, and journalist and political commentator Fred Weir speaking to us from the Russian capital, Moscow. With that, it brings us to an end here on this edition of the News Review, but do stay tuned. There's plenty more to come here on Press TV.